Cool. What is up, world? John Shute here again with another podcast. Today, I have the honor and privilege of being here with my good friend, Chris Day. Chris, how are you doing today?
Good, John. It's great. It's great to be on with you. Thanks so much for the invite.
No problem, man. I've been wanting to do a podcast for you since we've met. You've been totally an inspiration of mine since I first got in the industry. It's really cool to see how your life has evolved over the years, and mine as well. We've had the opportunity to do some really cool events together all over the country. We've done some really great things, raising money for great organizations. So I'm
Yep.
super proud of that. Um, Chris, you have maybe one of the most interesting minds in cannabis. I've had a lot of conversations. I wanted to first maybe break down your personal story a little bit and
Sure.
then dive into some of the really cool projects that you're working on because before we started the podcast, as I mentioned, you have a better global grasp on cannabis than most. So I always think it's really valuable to hear where your head's at any given moment in time.
Sure.
So
Happy
first,
to.
yeah, first, Chris, where are you from? And another common question on my podcast is, when did you first consume cannabis?
Well, we'll take them in order. I was actually born just outside of Detroit, Michigan, but grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Los Alamos, and Albuquerque. My dad was worked for Los Alamos Labs, and so really, I always, if people ask me, where are you from? I always answer originally New Mexico, but born out of Detroit, which is a fun conversation to have. It's a cultural juxtaposition for sure.
That for sure.
Yeah, but I've spent so much time over the years living in different places that I think where you start, really isn't as relevant as where you want to be. And I've certainly found that being based out of Colorado is where I want to be, and then spend as much time being a global citizen as I can.
100%. I know it's like crazy to think how fast paced traveling my life was prior to COVID. I think I spent more time with you in different states than here in Colorado where we both
Oh,
live.
absolutely, without a doubt. And now even
Would you
while it's
also
not my
I was
preferred method of travel, I've spent a lot of time still this year, talking to people all over the place. It's been a blessing in terms of saving the travel budget.
That's for sure. Totally.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, did like Colorado wise, like, do you see the advantages? Like, are you coming from like a lifestyle and a business perspective? Like, because this is just like kind of like a mature cannabis market. There's a lot of professionals
Yeah,
here, and then you also get the outdoors and that whole thing. Or
yeah. I mean, interestingly, it has nothing to do with cannabis. Cannabis is a nice side benefit because that's the industry that we've chosen to be in. But my first stint living in Colorado was when I went to Colorado State up in Fort Collins.
mm,
And that was, without dating myself too much, that was long before cannabis was legal in the state of Colorado. And, having grown up in New Mexico, Colorado was always where I went for vacations. I am an outdoors kind of guy. I like to camp and hike and ski and snowshoe and do all the kinds of things that you can do, out our back door. So for me, it's really the lifestyle and the wellness aspects that the state provides that attracts me to it. When I moved back to Colorado to get into the cannabis industry in 2017, after over a decade hiatus, I felt like I was coming home.
yeah.
So, and what brought me home was the fact that we had this whole new industry to work in that didn't exist when I left. So it was pretty cool.
And interesting. And do you have like a lot of folks I talk to, they have a story of like when they first started consuming cannabis, which kind of leads into why they initially got into the industry. Um,
Yeah, I think my story is a little bit different. I didn't start any type of cannabis consumption um, until much later in life than most. It's, I was a good, well trained product of the Dare program, right? And I had I had consumed plenty of propaganda to explain to me how terrible things were, but
yeah,
I've also always been a free thinker in the sense that if someone tells me that something is true, I'm going to question them to make sure. It's how I built my entire marketing and communications career. And so, really, what drove me into the cannabis space when I was looking at entering, because you can find marketing challenges anywhere. Where
yeah,
what you can't find anywhere is sort of the challenge of overcoming nearly a century of absolutely horrific propaganda and figuring out how do we solve this problem? How do we bring, clarity and justice where it's needed? And that is a huge part of what motivates me. Certainly, helping brands figure out how to sell more product, or helping states figure out how to legalize, or that kind of thing. Furthering research is important, but there's also very much a part of me that is infuriated by the lack of justice and the ignorance that exists. And so
I agree.
I'm able to do both of those things by entering. So that's really what brought me in. I, as a cannabis consumer, I am one that uses it primarily medicinally for things like sleep problems because I can't sleep worth a darn, and using them for sports applications and that kind of thing. Um, so that's more where I reside, and I love the plant, and I'm thankful to the plant for providing those kind of healthy options that don't require the typical pharmaceutical drugs.
Totally. Yeah, it's a huge reason why I got in the industry. I mean, I had a great job, living a great life on the beach, and had a bunch of friends struggling with opiates, and did a bunch of research on my own. What better way to educate people than through marketing, which is what I was doing at the time. And yeah, that kind of led into what I'm doing now. And I totally agree with everything you're saying. I feel like a lot of my motivation too is stemming from trying to make change, and um, you know, everything you're touching on, and with the brands and the marketing side of things specifically, I think it's really cool that you and I and the other folks who are like-minded are able to guide people in the right direction in the
Mhm.
cannabis space, especially from just like an environmental, community, social injustice perspective, because the industry deserves that. um,
Yeah, and that's something that as I've talked to people throughout the U.S., and then when I founded the Global Cannabis Network Collective and started really bringing companies together around the world to help expand cannabis markets, you realize very quickly that while the words change and the angles change a little bit, many of the problems are the same. And sadly, a lot of what we did in the U.S. Um, in terms of drug policy and that kind of thing have created not only a crisis in our own country, but a crisis around the world that we, in my opinion, we have a responsibility to try and affect in whatever ways we can.
totally agree. Yeah, it's really important for people to understand that too. um, Yeah, but one thing that boggles my mind throughout this pandemic is that cannabis is essential here during something none of us have ever experienced before, but yet there's still folks who are in prison uh, for the plant. Um, it's just kind of mind-boggling. Um, that kind of leads into what you're currently working on, Project Evolve.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've been involved in different um, marketing and cannabis projects over the years, but this is kind of your own personal project. And
Yeah,
tell us a little bit
I
more.
I actually co-founded it with Jillian Reddish. So
Okay.
Project Evolve as a company is positioned as a marketing think tank, and we operate primarily in two verticals. One is the cannabis landscape, and the other is the events industry. Um, Naturally, there's a fair amount of overlap there in most years. This
Yeah.
year, the events industry has had to do a lot of redefining itself, and so I have been working with a lot of uh, cannabis events in other parts of the world to talk about, how do you not lose traction in a year when you can't actually gather.
Yeah.
So we've been doing some of that, but then in the cannabis space, we do some true, brand architecture and strategy work for a number of companies. In terms of tactical execution, I ran and functioned within ad agencies and PR agencies for almost 25 years before I came into cannabis. And I don't really have an interest anymore in doing sort of much in the way of tactical execution. So we partner with a lot of other really good shops around the country. So I've got a nice network of people there to do that. And we handle a lot of the strategy work and brand architecture and positioning messaging. And then we also launched this thing that I referenced earlier, the Global Cannabis Network Collective, which is definitely where we're spending most of our time right now. It is a member-based organization of cannabis CEOs, lead scientists, researchers, investors, professionals who have multinational operations or soon will be multinational operators to help increase knowledge share, drive deal flow optimization, and really bring the global market together. Because just as in the United States, when you have a new state come up and there's a whole bunch of people who feel like they're alone and they don't know what the next steps are and they don't know how to do it, right? They look to other states to say, okay, who did things right? Who did things wrong? What can I learn? How can I do that? Well, that's the same thing that happens when a new country comes on board, right? If Ecuador came on board, which it did, it's going to look to Colombia and Peru to say, all right, what are we doing? How do we all work together, right?
Yeah.
Mexico, as we record this, Mexico yesterday passed its legal framework for medicinal cannabis. That's enormously powerful, right? So within the GCNC, we were talking to our members throughout Latin America yesterday about what are the short-term ramifications throughout LATAM with this new market in Mexico coming up.
Is Mexico going to be the largest medical market now?
In the world by far.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a legalized country nationally. And actually, I have a podcast recording myself tomorrow. I host International Cannabis Conversation on trichomes.com, and
Nice, with Ashley,
with one of the leading lobbyists in Mexico, and I'll be hosting that conversation. So
interesting.
Yeah, so we and that's what we do. We try to help inform and facilitate that knowledge to make sure that you've got responsible operations and people who have experience helping to build out the global landscape.
Which is super important. I've seen a lot of businesses reach roadblocks, fail, because they relied on someone who had zero experience in the cannabis space for a number, whether it be infrastructure, operational, product development, marketing. We end up taking over a ton of projects that people just have no idea what they're getting themselves into.
Yep.
That's awesome. I mean, I know this is probably a question you get on every podcast you're on, but where do you see the global cannabis market heading? Do you see just an overall global legalization, decriminalization? What are
Well,
your thoughts?
yeah. So in many ways, that's already happening.
Yeah,
Um, right. For U.S. audiences, if you don't spend much time looking at the world, I think sometimes we look at ourselves as leaders in the space, right? We definitely have lost that position. We lost it several years ago um, in uh, in terms of the global cannabis landscape. There's there is, however, certainly an international movement that is somewhat led by Canada. Canada certainly has been sort of the hub of international investment in the cannabis landscape for the last several years. You've got Europe at a continental level, at the EU level, really looking at how do you create systems that can regulate and control effectively the cannabis landscape, and various up until yesterday, right? Germany was sort of the leading market in the world in terms of population size for cannabis on the medicinal side. Really, internationally, it's not exclusively a medicinal discussion, but pretty close. Let's say it's
yeah,
95% a medicinal discussion, right? Um, and in South America, you've had a lot of countries coming on board with their policies. It, in a lot of ways, it indicates the weakening of the US position and chokehold on the international finance system and the international policies on drugs. You had the World Health Organization recommendation taken up and approved um, to decrease the level of control. It would be like the US descheduling from Schedule 1, right? The World Health Organization recommended that that happened, and that happened at the international level at the UN. And so there is this global movement to recognize the fact that regardless of the propaganda, there is valid research around the world that proves this plant has medicinal benefits and is not dangerous when used responsibly and ethically, right? So you've got Israel doing all kinds of medicinal research. They're looking at tons of technology that can be used both for increasing cultivation efficiency, absorption into the body, doing studies on the various cannabinoids and the entourage effect and how all of those things work together.
would
To
you say
potentially
Israel's leading the research front?
I would say so. I mean, there's a lot of research happening in a lot of places, but
Well, they've
in
been
my
doing it for the
opinion,
longest, right?
they've been doing it a long time.
Yeah,
Yeah. But I talked to Abhishek Mohan, who is the CEO of Hemp Street in New Delhi, India, a couple of weeks ago, right? And that market, while it's sort of got various levels of policies, they've had a relationship through the Ayurvedic medicine culture that exists in India for over 3,000 years, right? And so there's there's all of these things happening: South America, Australia, Europe, Asia, Central America, Canada. Here, we're the laggards at this point.
yeah,
Um, and and so what does that mean for the future? If you go to the Brightfield Group, they put out a pretty cool report in Q4 of last year looking at the European landscape and the potential income, if things go right, potential revenue opportunities generated by cannabis. And I mean, the numbers are astronomical, simply because there's this pent up demand that has been sort of falsely held back for a century.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Wow. What do you think? Are there any companies out there that you're really impressed by all around that are at a global level that you would suggest people maybe look into?
Um, I won't I won't make any like I don't play the invest in this company game type
Not
stuff.
not from an
I
investment perspective.
Yeah, I mean there's some companies that I've talked to that I think are really interesting normally because they're doing really interesting stuff and not playing up all the hype, right? They
Yeah,
aren't trying to get the headlines. They're just doing their thing because it's what their company does.
yeah.
Um, one of them is, say, Little Green Pharma out of Perth, Australia. So they have medicinal grade cannabis oils. They have a um, market domestically in Australia. They've created partnerships with insurance companies now down there. So there's insurance reimbursement for those products in Australia in certain cases. But then they knew that if they just stayed in the domestic market of Australia, which is relatively speaking pretty small,
Yeah.
they had a cap. They're publicly listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, and they now have products on the shelves in the UK, and as of about 3 weeks ago, available in Germany as well.
Wow.
This is the work necessary to make that happen is immense, right?
Yeah.
You gotta get your products, and then you've got to get EU GMP certified to even consider going into Europe. You got to deal with all of the export licenses. You got to maintain your brand and what's going on domestically in Australia. Like you look at companies like that, which yeah, they get some coverage, but nothing like what some of the other companies that are always trying to push the headlines are doing just to
Yeah.
drive up their stock price, right? Um, so I like Little Green Pharma. I talked to um, the founders of a
Do they have
company.
any patents or anything like that on their formulations and stuff? Is that
Yeah, of
yeah,
course. I mean, you've got to have that kind of protection, right?
yeah.
So, and then there's another good example that I really like out of Israel is this company called Mycrops. Um,
I
and
think I've heard of them.
they have what originally hooked me is they have this app, right? That you can take a picture of the flower that you're looking at, provided it's a high THC flower. There's some restrictions, but it'll come back and tell you essentially what the THC content is of that flower through a picture. There's
What?
some there's
That's
some
crazy.
really cool science behind it that makes that work. But you know what? Once I got to talk to their chief science officer and their CEO, I realized that actually is not the coolest thing about them by far. They are using high res imagery technology um, and an enormous database of hundreds of thousands of images to do predictive analytics within grow facilities to get ahead of disease and contamination.
Whoa.
So, right. So imagine if you have all of your greenhouses and your grow facilities with their cameras in there, and instead of having to inspect every single plant all the time to check for disease or infestation or
Just go to your
contamination,
phone.
you get a notice through your relationship with Mycrops, and it says, hey, you want to check this plant because we're detecting a potential problem.
Holy shit.
The cost efficiency of that and the ability to ensure that you don't lose an entire harvest, for example, is pretty cool. And they
It's
have
amazing.
they have test facilities in various parts of the world already up and running. I mean, they're doing this. It's not theory, and it's very quiet, right?
Wow.
Like a
Dude,
handful
that's
of
a
people are
complete
hooked
game
up.
changer. I mean,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, and that's on the cultivation side. So you've got companies like Little Green Pharma doing great things, getting products, medicinal grade product into international markets to help patients. And at the same time, advocating for things like insurance reimbursement in the markets they're in. You have My Crops helping cultivators do things more efficiently out of Israel. We have companies like Can Farm out of Peru that in the US, we would say they're an organic company, but they don't even define themselves that way, right? It's just what they do. And so there's a whole discussion on how do you, grow crops safely. It's a discussion that happens all the time in agriculture.
Yeah.
It's now finally catching up in the international markets, frankly, at a pace greater than what we have in the United States, I think.
Interesting. Chris, where can people find, I know your Project Evolve information is on alwaysdriveinnovation.com. Is there a separate website for your collective, or is that information on there as well?
It's there. If you just go alwaysdriveinnovation.com/cannabis, that'll get you there right away. And of course, people can listen to me pontificate on stuff with people at International Cannabis Conversation on trichomes.com. That's a bi-weekly deal right now.
Cool.
In February or March, it'll probably go weekly. This year has started off busy. It takes time. So, and we want to do it right.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I feel like I have a million questions myself. We're going to probably have to do another podcast again sometime.
Sure. And email me. People can email me at chris.day@alwaysdriveinnovation.com. Happy to talk about this kind of stuff all day long.
Cool. And then for all you listeners out there, I'll include Chris's email in the podcast description and in the corresponding blog that I'll produce. Thank you very much, Chris, and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.